Hello, everybody. So we are back with World War II. We're going to try to get through this as quick as we can. Um, with any luck, this might be the last section you need based on what they say about the new style of AP exam they're doing this year, but I'll keep doing more, mostly just to fill time so you can keep learning history. And if the exam goes beyond World War II, we will keep having these. Hopefully, I'll have this done today and posted. So let's go ahead and get started. So we start World War II in 1931 and we end it in 1945. 31 we start with because that's the beginning of the Japanese attacking China, which often in European history books doesn't get mentioned as the start of World War II. They tend to focus on when Germany invades Poland, but it's when Japan invades China that we first start to see the U.S. having to respond in different ways. Not that they do almost anything in 31, but that's kind of the beginning of this onslaught of the totalitarian aggressors that's going to prompt the event we call World War II. It ends in 45 for the obvious reason that that's when the year the Germans and the Japanese surrender, prompting the end of World War II. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so we start with the causes of World War II. They're pretty straightforward. In many ways, it gets started because of the Great Depression. Basically, people all around the world were broke and desperate and hungry and willing to follow basically anyone that would lead them into success, or at least convince them that they could lead them to success. And so we're going to see a lot of world leaders play upon that, FDR included. Franklin Roosevelt did the exact same thing a lot of these other leaders did. Luckily, as far as promising to help people in the hard times, luckily for us, he wasn't a complete lunatic who ends up doing all sorts of awful, awful things to humanity, as we'll see with some of these guys. But just know it's out of the Great Depression that World War II begins. Another thing that's going to cause World War II is the failure of the Treaty of Versailles, and there's several things about that. If you go back to the end of World War One, one, the League of Nations failed. Its job was to prevent things like World War II, but the problem was it didn't really have an enforcement arm. It could threaten a bunch of countries. It could tell them it was going to invade them, but ultimately, whereas the League will threaten a lot of nations, it doesn't actually back it up at any point, and so that's going to cause these aggressor nations like Germany and Japan and a few others to continue to be aggressive. Another one was with how Germany, Italy, and Japan, who are going to be the three major Axis powers from World War II, the quote unquote bad guys, if you're looking at it from our perspective, which granted they were very bad, obviously. But basically, what ends up happening with Germany is they felt like they were treated badly by the treaty with reparations, having to sign the war guilt clause. Italy, who only joined World War One so that they could gain a bunch of colonies, and they really didn't get that much out of it. And Japan, for the same reason, they had wanted to gain a bunch of colonies uh, when they joined World War One, but they didn't get them. So this dissatisfaction is going to give the leaders that rise up in these countries, like Mussolini, Hitler, and the Japanese military, the opportunity to kind of play upon that prejudice of the people. And then the last thing that's going to happen is if you go all the way back to the Treaty of Versailles, there was disagreement amongst the Allies, with the U.S. not wanting to do a number of the things that England and France did, and England and France disagreeing about the severity, and those disagreements are going to continue to haunt them. So as these terrible world leaders like Hitler and the Japanese military and Mussolini and others rise up, there's going to be a lot of disagreement where England will be say to France, hey, if you wouldn't have been so harsh on them, this wouldn't happen. Or France said, if you would have been more harsh, it would have happened. The U.S. just trying to hide from all of it and say, hey, this is your guys' fault. But either way, going back to the Treaty of Versailles, you have these three different qualities that come out of the treaty, and all three of them are going to play a role in how World War II is going to develop. Okay. And then maybe the most important direct cause of it is out of the Great Depression. As I mentioned before, we're going to see the rise of several totalitarian regimes. Totalitarian, just a word we talk about in this era where a leader is going to rise up and try to rule the people, not just their actions, but also like their thought. They're going to try to eliminate dissent, hence this totalitarian regime. And there's several of these famous leaders. That is a picture of a guy who rises up in late 1920s, early 1930s China. That's Mao Zedong, if you don't recognize him. That's going to be his arch rival, who also attempts to be a leader over there. That's going to be Chiang Kai-shek. And they're going to have a fight in the Civil War in China to see who gains power, with Chiang Kai-shek winning early and then Mao Zedong obviously winning late. And out of his government comes the People's Republic of China that we still have today. Okay, that's going to be Francisco Franco, who rises up in Spain and does a lot of the same things. Not to the severity, but there's going to be a Spanish Civil War that he's going to win, and he's going to function basically as a fascist leader. That's Benito Mussolini. He's going to be the Italian leader. who tries to conquer North Africa. He's head of the fascist party in Italy that plays a lot on this aggressive kind of unitarian authority out of the leader, that he's going to call himself Il Duce, and he's also going to build into that. That's kind of what fascism is, not just this really strong central government, but build on a lot of racial theories where he believes the Italians, the Romans are this noble race, and they're going to go out and conquer the lesser races of the world, which he would then identify as North Africa, as he's trying to, quote unquote, rebuild the Roman Empire. But he's not going to be super successful at that, but he does pave the way for other leaders who sadly are more successful at gaining power. Okay, that's going to be Joseph Stalin, who takes over for Vladimir Lenin once he dies, and he's going to basically take the communist state that Lenin created and make it even more authoritarian and ruthless. And under his watch, tons and tons of people are going to die in the Soviet Union, and he will go down in history as one of the worst dictators of all time. Okay, you have that. That's going to be Tojo Hideki, who eventually becomes the leader in Japan by the early 1940s, and he's one of the high ups in the military over there, and he's going to be the one that leads them into a lot of the things they do in World War II that obviously are going to be problematic for a lot of nations in the Pacific. Okay, and then obviously Adolf Hitler, most of us know parts of his story, but once again, a totalitarian that rises out of the Great Depression, who fuels his rise with playing upon hope. I'm going to save Germany and all that nonsense, and also obviously the racial theories of the Aryan race are superior and all that stuff. So we see similarities between a lot of these guys who are playing on the Great Depression, playing upon the prejudices of the people, and playing towards this racist ideology that we would call fascism. And so ultimately, these are going to be the things that are going to happen. These are going to be the governments that rise up, and this is why World War II is going to happen. And yet, while all that's happening, we're going to see famously the Allies practice something that historians look back and call appeasement. Appeasement being a process where, as these leaders rise up and gain power, the Allied leaders are going to basically defer to them, appease them, just give in little ways to hopefully avoid a war, avoid conflict. And if they can do that, they feel like there won't be a war, as a lot of people felt burned by World War I and did not want to participate in a growing war. But sadly, appeasement is actually just going to make the war even worse once it does come, as a lot of these leaders gain a ton of power during the 3 to 5 years that Allies were practicing appeasement with them. The most famous example that you're going to see when Neville Chamberlain, that's the guy on the left, you can see in that picture up there, and Adolf Hitler, who you can recognize, obviously, are going to meet to discuss what to do with Czechoslovakia, where Hitler had said he wanted Czechoslovakia. The British and the French said no, but Neville Chamberlain shows up at Munich. They have the Munich Conference and Munich Pact that comes out of it, where Neville Chamberlain basically says to Hitler he can have a good chunk of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland, if Hitler agrees to stop taking territory, which Hitler agreed to, obviously had no intention of following through on that. But out of that, once Hitler does take over the rest of Czechoslovakia, you're going to see once again Chamberlain and the French tell Hitler, okay, but no more territory. And that's just going to be probably the most famous example of this appeasement policy that's going to lead to World War II being much worse once it begins. And so what ends up happening is in 1933, the Japanese are going to formally go into China and take over Manchuria, and the Nazis in Germany are obviously going to march into Poland and take over that. And those are kind of the 2 years really where we start to see the war break out in Europe, Poland, and then the war break out in Asia, China, obviously, where these totalitarians really start to make their presence felt. And England, France, the United States, eventually Russia, Soviet Union are going to have to respond. And that's the event we call World War II. All right, so the main question, this is what they tend to focus on the AP exam, is what do we do in response to this? This has been an essay question a few times. It's been multiple choice questions a few times. But ultimately, the U.S. did not want a war, and so much like we were talking about with England and France, the desire was to stay out, to stay isolationist, and that's exactly what's going to happen. We're going to see this force especially prevalent in Congress, where Congress is going to do its best as the world does start to descend into war, as China gets invaded by Japan in 1933. Congress is going to respond, and the first thing they're going to do is they're going to try to investigate. So what caused the United States to get drawn into World War I? Because if we can figure out what caused us to get drawn into World War I, we can now stay out of World War II. And out of that comes the Nye Committee report, where what they propose is a theory called the Merchants of Death concept. And the Merchants of Death concept basically says that we got into World War One because American businesses and banks had gotten us economically tangled with the Allied powers, England and France mostly, in World War One. And so because we had loaned them so much money and loaned them so many supplies, and there was so much credit built up between us and them, that it got to the point in World War One where if we didn't get into World War One, we would lose all that money. And so the Nye Committee is saying that's what prompted us to go into World War One. Historians today would tell you that's not the whole story, but it might be part of the story. But either way, that's the report that our Congress was acting under. And so out of that, they're going to pass several bills. The first one is called the Johnson Act of 34. This basically forbade the U.S. government or any private company in America for marketing securities to any belligerent nation meaning a nation at war. To simplify that, it basically means nobody can loan money to a country if that country's at war. So that's going to try to keep one end of economic entanglement from happening with these countries at war. But much more famously, it shows up on the AP exam a lot, is 1935, 36, 37, different neutrality acts. And these neutrality acts are better known as the cash and carry program. The cash and carry program because it says if any nation wants to buy material from us and that nation is at war, well, one, they cannot buy using credit, so there can be no loans. They have to pay cash, hence this cash and carry program. And two, we will not deliver it to them. So it's not going to be on American boats. That way we don't have American boats getting sunk like we saw in the lead up to World War I. So if a British boat wants to come and it wants to pick up material, it can. So it's a cash and carry. So they pay cash, they carry it, but then also it said that it was only good on things that were indirect war material. So we're not going to sell anybody guns. We're not going to sell anybody tanks. We're not going to sell anybody bullets. We could sell you steel or food or oil or things like that, but nothing that could directly be used in war. So between the Johnson Act and the Neutrality Cash and Carry Acts, our Congress is trying to set us up to not get involved in the war. And the reason they're doing this during those 4 years is A, China gets invaded by Japan in 1933, and then B, Hitler comes to power in 34. By 36, he's marching in the Rhineland. By 38, he's marching into Austria. And by later in 38, he's marching into Czechoslovakia. So it's clear that these world leaders are trying to, and Mussolini invaded North Africa by that point. So it's clear that these world leaders are causing a war that's going to grow. So our Congress is trying to keep us out of it. And you see this Dr. Seuss cartoon where Dr. Seuss is basically trying to say America needs to be more aware of this. Like we could actually help these countries, but the neutrality that are being attacked, like China or Austria or Czechoslovakia or North African countries. But at the end of the day, we can't because of this Neutrality Act. So he's mocking the U.S. with this idea. Okay, and so we have that. Now, as that's happening, FDR is trying to, as a world leader, more in the line of Woodrow Wilson, more of an internationalist, more of somebody that recognizes we're going to have to get involved in this, whether we like it or not, and so we better do it sooner. He tries to push us in, but he also knows he has to be careful. So after he wins the election of 1936, and if you remember that from the last unit, that was a massive, massive victory where he just destroys Alf Landon from Kansas. The only two states that voted against him were Vermont and Maine. And so with that much political capital behind him, he believes he is able to use that to push us towards a war. And so that's going to be the point where he makes this quarantine speech that we talked just briefly about in the last unit, where he basically says there's dictators rising up all around the world. Don't think for 1 minute they're not eventually going to mess with us or affect our trade or do something that's going to hurt us directly or indirectly, in which case what we need to do is we need to work with other democracies to stop this. We need to quarantine this evil. We need to quarantine these totalitarians. That is America's role. Now, the problem with that is America was not ready for that. So we're going to see that cause a major pushback in the country, where out of that comes a group rising up called the America First Committee, headed by Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh and other famous Americans, that basically said, as you can see in their title, the America First. We don't want to have to participate in this war, and we're mad at FDR for trying to suggest we do. And so FDR is actually going to, his party is going to lose a lot of seats in the upcoming midterm elections in 38, in large part because a lot of people thought he was pushing us into war, which he continued to do. As we have this bullet point that says preparedness, it's because even after he made this speech, even after public polling kind of suggested Americans weren't ready for this, even after the America First Committee formed, he still set aside over $1 billion to start building war vessels, and he enlarged the size of our army. So kind of like Woodrow Wilson did, it was risky, but he knew Americans didn't want it, but he recognized we would probably need it. And so we needed to get started whether Americans want it or not. And that would prove costly in those midterm elections where his party is going to lose a lot of power. Where after the midterm elections of 38, between Republicans and conservative Southern Democrats, they are able to stop New Deal legislation from passing. So that bullet point kind of kills the New Deal. And or at least large parts of it, or at least its expansion. And so out of that, we see where FDR trying to push us towards a war is something that Americans just weren't ready for yet. But that's all going to change when Poland falls, because in September of 1939, the Nazi Germans invade Poland. And whereas a lot of people thought Poland would probably lose in a war against Germany, a lot of people thought they would be able to hold up for a year, 2 or 3. So when the Nazis beat them in less than 10 days, it wakes up a lot of people's eyes where they're saying, oh my goodness, Germany's a lot stronger than we thought they were. So perhaps we need to stop them now before it gets any worse. And whereas Americans are not quite ready to join the war, we're at least willing to consider helping those who are fighting. So England and France will declare war on Germany at that point. And with that, we readjust our neutrality acts, the 35, 36, 37 ones that were cash and carry on indirect war material now becomes cash and carry on anything. So we still want people to pay cash. We still want people to carry it, but now we're willing to sell you direct war material. And so in order to stay neutral, we have to offer that deal to everybody. So England and France are going to be able to take advantage of it because they control the oceans. They have big navies, they have big ships, they have big cash reserves. So England and France are going to be able to send ships to America to buy a lot of this direct war material on a cash and carry basis. The problem is countries like China, who we supported over the Japanese, but in order to stay neutral, we could not limit it to the Japanese or limit it from the Japanese. So the Japanese were actually able to buy some direct war material to use against the Chinese under this program as well, which is unfortunate, but just a necessity apparently our Congress thought because we were trying to maintain this neutrality. And that's how it's going to stay for about a year until 1940. By June of 1940, the Nazis who defeated Poland now turn west and defeat France. And whereas France was supposed to be the number one military power in the world, at least their army was, they get defeated in just a little over a month. The fighting really stopped after 2 to 3 weeks. But with France falling, and not just falling, but falling rapidly, it really woke up a lot of people's eyes in America to the fact that this was a serious threat, that the Japanese were obviously causing lots of problems over in Asia and the Pacific, and that we now are looking at a Germany that might conquer the entire continent of Europe if somebody doesn't do something with that. So whereas we don't join the war yet, we do get even more supportive of warlike measures, where we passed the Burke-Wadsworth Act, which was the first peacetime military draft in U.S. history, where under the Burke-Wadsworth Act, we will actually draft over 1 million people into the Army, even though the U.S. is not even at war yet. And the fact people tolerated this shows you that Americans are starting to realize we may not be at war yet, but it's coming, so we need to get prepared. The second thing we did is we made what was called the Destroyer Deal. The Destroyer Deal is basically where we gave the British a little over 40 destroyers. Those are boats that are used to escort cargo ships or other naval vessels that attack and defend against submarines. The boats weren't even that good, but we gave them to the British just to help them so that their fleet could continue to come and buy supplies from the U.S., and we traded those destroyers for a bunch of British bases in the Western Hemisphere, just small little ports here and there on some islands and other places, in order so that the British would not have to guard them. So basically, we're trying to support the British without technically supporting them, since we did make a trade with them in theory. But it was obvious that we were starting to take the side of the Allies, even though we are not officially at war yet. But that's going to change as the U.S. joins the war. Okay, and so the series of events that's going to lead us to join the war all begins in the election of 1940, where the Germans are starting to conquer Europe, the Japanese are conquering China and starting to take over other possessions in the Pacific, and FDR has shown that he's willing to support the Allies. And whereas that cost him in the midterm elections in 1938, it's not going to do so much here. Now, the Republicans are going to run a guy named Wendell Willkie, who used to be a Democrat. And he's a guy who's going to pledge to support the New Deal. And whereas a lot of Republicans said, hey, we ought to stop and we ought to call FDR a warmonger and run on a strict isolationist ticket, Willkie refused to do so. He said no, because even though we want FDR to lose, like it's not fair to say that we can just ignore this war. Democrats, on the other hand, run FDR. And this is unprecedented. This is his third go at it. And needless to say, we never had a President Wendell Willkie, so he will get a third term. He'll also get a fourth later. And so the Democrats run FDR, and FDR is going to pick a running mate named Henry Wallace. And this is going to become important because Henry Wallace was a socialist. And as a socialist, this is going to scare a lot of the moderate Democrats or more conservative Democrats like Southern Democrats who are going to start to say, hey, FDR, we want somebody a little more moderate. So when he runs for his fourth term, he's going to pick a more moderate Democrat named Harry Truman, and he's obviously going to become a president. So the fact that he picked Wallace is going to end up being consequential. And so what do we see happen? Well, FDR has his worst showing so far in a general election, even though he still wins fairly easily. But he's starting to lose internal parts of the country because these were the parts of the country that were most isolationist. And they're starting to look at the world and say, we don't want this. We don't want to get involved in this war. So whereas he still loses Maine and Vermont, he now loses a bunch of states in the middle. And these states are going to just obviously oppose that it looks like he's pushing us into war. But now that he's won and won fairly easily while saying we're going to have to get involved in this war, that now makes him feel like he can. And so he's going to pass the Lend-Lease Act as soon as he gets reinaugurated, March of 41. And this is going to completely change the Neutrality Act cash and carry program, where instead of cash, it is now loan, hence that Lend-Lease part. And instead of delivery, it's going to be, or instead of carry, it's going to be delivery. So basically, instead of cash and carry, it's going to be loan and deliver. So what ends up happening is he's going to start using this to give tons and tons and tons of supplies to the allies, the countries that are at war with Germany and the countries that are at war with Japan, mostly China over in the Pacific. And so we're going to start doing that. And we're doing it to support the war without technically getting involved with it. So we become what FDR says the arsenal of democracy. We're all these democratic nations. We are their arsenal. We are the ones producing their weapons. We are the one producing their supplies, producing their food, producing anything they need. And we're willing to deliver it to them because we're trying to keep them afloat. So this is what a lot of history books would say. It is giving allies everything supporting a war except for troops. And so with that, you see pictures like this. Once again, Dr. Seuss, a political cartoonist during the time period where you have the U.S. dropping this stuff off in Iceland at the time, and then the British would come pick it up, hence the 2/3 of the way to England in the cartoon. Okay, and so this is getting us closer to war, and we're supporting the Allies a lot. But then it's obviously going to be as our relationship with Germany, our relationship with Japan continues to deteriorate as we don't trade things to them, and as we're making it abundantly clear we don't support them, so we're not functioning like a neutral nation anymore. But eventually it is going to be the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. That's going to prompt us to actually get in the war. Most of you know the story. I'll just run through some pictures of it real quick. The Japanese sneak attack our Navy in Hawaii. A lot of you've seen these photographs before. There's a picture that was taken from a plane that day. You can see all the boats in the harbor, and many of them get sunk, obviously. A lot of lives lost. Very tragic event. And there's planes on the ground getting blown up. There's boats sinking. The famous USS Arizona that goes down, which you can still go see. Okay, there's another boat sinking, more explosions. You've seen these pictures before, probably. It's a very famous event. Okay, and then the U.S., December 8th, FDR makes his famous speech on the radio, December 7th, 1941, a day that will live in infamy, and he asked the Congress to declare war. And they did. They declared war on Japan, but because Japan and Germany were allies, Germany then declares war on us, and so that prompted us to declare war on them. And as you can see in the Honolulu newspaper, war, Oahu, the island Pearl Harbor, that bombed by Japanese planes. And it says 6 known dead, 21 injured, but obviously over 2,000 were killed. So this was a very early run paper, and it didn't quite know the details of what was going on. But with that, we are now involved in the war. And the most important thing to get ready for the war is we need to mobilize, because we were already sort of preparing for the war as a result of the Lend-Lease Act and the Burke-Wadsworth Act. But we had a long way to go. So much like in World War I, you're going to see in World War II a lot of the same programs. All right, so how did we mobilize? Okay, one, we had to get our industry ready, so we're going to create a number of agencies, the most famous of which was the War Production Board. And much like the War Industries Board in World War I, it had a lot of ability to leverage resources, make sure factories had the right amount of stuff, tell them how much they were going to produce, et cetera, et cetera. And that's going to lead to a lot of our, obviously, mobilization of industry. Famously, you have Henry Ford, who converts a lot of his factories over to building war material. A lot of people say he built tanks, but honestly, the most famous thing he built, you can see in these pictures, they were B-24 bombers, Liberators. It used to be we could build on average about one of these per day. But once Henry Ford started to study how to build them and what was required, and he converted several of his factories over to start building parts and assemble these things, it got to the point where instead of building one per day, we could build one per hour. Not literally in 1 hour, but we were producing on average 24 per day. And so that's going to be one of the more famous examples of how we produce the material we need to win the war. There's a picture of one flying. There's a picture with the V8 engine that was used in it that used to be used in cars before that. And obviously they upgrade it to operate a plane and whatnot. And the impact of this is obviously the U.S. is going to become fully industrialized, fully mobilized, and fully employed. So as a result of the full employment that we're going to see as mobilizing for World War II, this is going to be the end of the Great Depression, where America is going to have full employment. People are making money again. There's no more Great Depression, less need for a New Deal type government philosophy. And obviously, this can be the most important reason we win the war, whereas our soldiers fight bravely and we're well led by a bunch of our generals. Ultimately, what causes us to win the war or play a role in winning the war, a very important role, is that we just produce more stuff than the other people could. The Japanese could not keep up with the amount of stuff we were producing. The Germans could not keep up with the amount of stuff we were producing. So whereas other countries produce better material than us, sometimes no one could produce more than us. And so that's going to be why we end up winning. Another thing, we had to raise a lot of money. The war was exceedingly expensive. It's going to cost a ton. It's going to cost more than double what our country had spent and in the entire rest of its history combined. Obviously, very, very expensive. Okay, in large part, we're gonna pay a significant chunk of that in tax. The Revenue Act of 1942 raises income taxes, corporate taxes, excess profit taxes. Taxes go through the roof. Like if you're in the highest income bracket, you were paying over 90% in income tax during the war on money above like $1 million because the government needs to pay for the war, but ultimately it didn't. It couldn't have paid for the war. It just paid a large chunk of the war. The other bit we're going to get from war bonds. And as you can see, there are pictures like this. They're trying to get people to buy bonds, but bonds are debt. Our debt when the war started was roughly $40 billion. Might have been just a hint over that. By the end of the war, it was $258 billion. So in a 4-year period, our debt goes up by, what is that, about 6.5 times. So obviously the war was exceedingly expensive, and the bulk of it is going to be paid by debt. So whereas the New Deal did cost money, our debt prior to the New Deal was roughly 19 billion. By the end of the 1930s, it was 40 billion. So our debt did double. The New Deal cost a little bit of money, obviously, but it's World War II that's really going to cause our debt to skyrocket because that was a really expensive event that there was just no way to pay for except by borrowing money, which we do. And so you see more pictures, buy war bonds, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but we also needed to get people in the war. And so there's going to be a significant amount of just human capital that needs to be employed. And the major way we did it was with the draft. So we would draft people, large numbers of people, over 15 million. Obviously, we needed tons and tons of soldiers because we're not just fighting a big war in Europe, we're fighting a big war in Asia and the Pacific. And so there's just no way you're going to get enough volunteers. Keep in mind, our nation's population was only like 130, 140 million, or depending what year you're looking at. So when you're talking about 15 million people getting drafted, you're talking over 10% of the U.S. population got forced into the war. But even that wasn't enough. So we're going to have to seek sources that were not traditionally used in combat. One of the most famous examples of that would be African Americans, who, again, they've been in the military for all of our country's history, but frequently they were used in segregated units, discriminated against units, paid less, didn't have opportunities to become officers, wouldn't be used in combat duty. And so basically America treated them worse, treated them as lesser soldiers, lesser citizens. But in World War II, we just needed manpower so badly that we didn't have that luxury. So in World War II, whereas I'm sure there was some reluctance amongst people in the military, African Americans were going to be allowed to participate in combat duty. sometimes fully equal with the opportunities presented to white soldiers, which was unusual in American history up till that point. But that's going to be a very important event. Whereas a lot of the brave service offered by African American soldiers in this war is going to open up a lot of people's eyes, to just how wrong Jim Crow society and segregation and just these prejudicial views of inequality are. But B, it then said, well, if they're fighting exceedingly bravely in this war, like what else could they do at least as well as white citizens or white soldiers that they aren't getting the opportunity to do yet? And you don't need me to probably tell you the most famous example. This is going to be the Tuskegee Airmen, a group of pilots. That's not all of them. That's just some of them in this photograph who are going to fight exceedingly well. They were combat pilots. They flew escort duty for the most part in the North African campaigns and in the Mediterranean and in Italy. And they had a much higher rate of success. And by success, as an escort fighter pilot, basically you're protecting bombers and you're protecting cargo planes from getting shot down by enemy fighters, where they had I think it was over double the rate of success of planes not getting shot down as a typical escort fighter regiment would have. So the Tuskegee Airmen go down in history as being some of the most famous fighter pilots in U.S. history. And obviously the fact that they were black and became celebrities in the United States for the bravery, for the courage, for the just sheer competence they showed in being able to fly and fly well and down German fighters and Italian planes, that it just raised a lot of awareness as to the potential for African American soldiers in the war, but also broadly in the community as well. And that's going to be why World War II, one of many reasons why World War II becomes this huge turning point in people's views on race. And we're going to start to see the civil rights movement really gain a lot of momentum as soon as World War II is over. Another example of how we had to get human capital employed in the war so that we could support it would be the large number of women that served. And women are going to serve in many different ways, almost always in support duties. But we're going to see groups like the WACs, that's women that served in the Army. You're going to see the WAVES, that's women that served in the Navy. You're going to see the WASPs, those are women that served in the Air Force. And then SPARs, that's going to be women that served in the Coast Guard. Only the Marines are going to be the branch of the military that doesn't allow women to serve yet. But in all of these, the roles women are doing, frequently it shows the cult of domesticity's impact, where they're almost never doing things like combat or participating, flying in dangerous areas where planes are getting shot down a lot. But they do a lot of like secretarial work, nursing. There are women in WASPs that fly planes and stuff like that, but typically like behind lines where there's less risk of getting shot down. But we're going to see hundreds of thousands of women support the war directly through working in the military, which then frees up men to go fight in combat duty and whatnot. So basically, we had to do a lot. And there's also going to be a lot of other soldiers from other ethnic groups that just weren't traditionally employed, like people of Mexican descent would be a very famous example of that. But the two major things you would see on an AP exam would be the support of the war amongst women and amongst African Americans. All right, another thing, we had to expand our labor resources. Just like in World War I, we had to get more people. And so what we're going to see, sorry, hit the button too quick there, a lot of people going to join the war effort. The most famous example of this would be there's another Great Migration North, where in World War I we had over 450,000 African Americans move from the rural Southeast to the North. We're going to see over 1 million in World War II, so substantially more. We're going to see a lot of people brought over that we'll talk about later from Latin America, especially Mexico, to work on farms. And we'll go into detail on that a little bit more later in the unit. And then women, of course, and you'll see famously, everybody knows the "We Can Do It" poster that frequently gets called Rosie the Riveter. But yeah, so just a lot of different sources. So very similar story to what we see in World War I. Okay, and then we're also going to see rationing. A lot of rationing was used in this war. You can see this is a food chart telling people, to limit their diets and whatnot. Which, don't ask me why they break it down this way, but you have protective foods, energy foods, bodybuilding foods, and be sure to eat one from each group every day. So if you have cheese and potatoes and margarine and potatoes, apparently that's supposed to be good for you. So, but either way, we got a long way to go in science, and posters like that kind of show it to us. All right, another example would be, these are ration books from World War II, where you can see you would get these in the mail, and this would allow you to buy certain products. Like, you're not allowed to have more than 2 pounds of sugar a month, or 10 pounds of coffee a month, or just whatever the different items were. These were the only, you could only buy it if you had a ration book. If you were found like buying stuff on the black market, you could go to jail for that. But again, our country just trying to conserve all our resources so that there be enough for the war and for people in need out abroad in the world. But either way, our country is mobilizing again.